Dobro. History. Archive.
December 20th, 1987. It was supposed to be a routine inter-island voyage navigating the pretty calm waters of the Tablas Strait in the Philippines.
Or
Thousands of people just trying to get home for Christmas.
the Christmas rush.
Exactly. But by the end of that night, this journey would end in, well, an almost unimaginable catastrophe, one that would enter the history books under the name Asia's Titanic.
And that Titanic comparison, I get why people make it for the scale, but it's actually really misleading.
How so?
If we want to understand what really happened, we have to move past it right away. The Titanic was, in a way, this story of tragic grandeur, right? Hubris versus nature. About 1,500 people lost to the freezing cold.
An iceberg, a force of nature.
Exactly. The MV Doña Paz, though, this was something else entirely. It was a chaotic, horrifying inferno, and it was completely preventable.
And the death toll, it just dwarfs the Titanic.
Oh, completely. We're talking an estimated 4,386 lives. So this wasn't about an iceberg. It was about human negligence, a catastrophic structural failure, and just fire, a sea of fire.
The scale of that number, 4,386, officially makes the Doña Paz disaster the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in recorded history.
It does.
And a statistic that huge, it risks becoming abstract. It's just a number. So our mission in this deep dive is to move beyond that, to really humanize this crisis. We're going to be using survivor accounts, detailed court records, and post-accident inquiries from the Board of Marine Inquiry, the BMI.
We're going to try and systematically reconstruct what you could call the architecture of the disaster.
Right. We're not just looking at the final terrible moments of impact.
No, we're looking at why. Why was this accident, when you look at all the pieces, almost inevitable? Why were so many people on that ship? Why were the safety systems not just ignored, but in some cases, actively disabled?
So what's our initial thesis here, based on all that source material?
It's that the sinking was the tragic but inevitable casualty of a perfect storm. It was this convergence of corporate greed, regulatory apathy, and a pervasive cultural acceptance of massive risk.
A failure of systems, not fate.
A spectacular, horrifying failure of multiple human systems. This was not an act of God.
Okay, so let's unpack that, starting with the colossal lie at the very core of this tragedy, and that's the capacity mismatch.
The numbers are just. They're hard to wrap your head around. The MV Doña Paz was officially legally refurbished to carry 1,518 passengers and crew.
1,500.
1,500. Yet on that evening, all the credible estimates, the ones that came out later, they agree was carrying well over 4,000 souls.
4,000. That's almost 3 times the legal limit. So the question isn't just how this happened, but why? Why was this culture of just extreme overcrowding not just tolerated, but almost relied upon?
And to understand the why, you really have to anchor yourself in the socioeconomic context of the Philippines in 1987. This was a nation dealing with immense financial strain. Poverty was rampant, especially in the outlying provinces.
And the Doña Paz was servicing a key route for those provinces.
The critical route. For people in economically impoverished areas like Samar and Leyte, specifically the Waray people, Manila wasn't just a bigger city, it was everything. It was the only viable source of stable employment, of economic opportunity.
So that route, the Manila-Tacloban route, it wasn't a leisure cruise line, it was a lifeline.
It was a literal lifeline. It connected these provinces to the central economic engine of the entire country. The whole route was defined by pure necessity.
And that necessity would spike at certain times of the year.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which brings us to this annual sociological phenomenon, the Christmas rush. And you have to understand, this is so much deeper than just traveling home for the holidays.
It's a cultural obligation.
It's a critical, large-scale annual migration. It's driven by these incredibly deep familial and cultural bonds. The workers are earning wages in Manila. They are expected, almost obligated, to return to their home provinces, bringing money, goods, gifts, everything to support their extended families.
And the infrastructure just could not handle that massive movement of people.
Not even close. I mean, think about it. Air travel, prohibitively expensive for the working class, and it just didn't have the capacity. So that left the maritime ferries, these slow, massive, but very old ships, as the only real option for mass transportation.
They were called the jeepneys of the sea.
That's the term. It's perfect. It refers to those highly overloaded, ever-present public transport buses on land. It tells you everything you need to know about how these ferries were viewed and used. They were workhorses, not luxury liners.
So in the days leading up to December 20th, Tackledown Port must have just been a boiling point of desperation.
The sources, especially the survivor accounts, describe a scene of just utter chaos, a mad rush. You have thousands of passengers, many of whom have been waiting for days, just clamoring, pushing, fighting for a space on any vessel leaving.
And that kind of desperation creates an environment where rules just go out the window.
They don't just bend, they are actively dismantled. Profit and just cramming people on board become the only priorities. Safety protocols are the first thing to be sacrificed.
So we're talking about more than just a few extra people squeezing on deck. This is a systemic breakdown of governance that allowed it to happen.
It's precisely that. This environment fueled a massive black market for boarding passes. Scalpers, often working, hand in glove with corrupt port officials, were selling boarding slots at hugely inflated prices.
And the officials are just turning a blind eye.
Turning a blind eye and lining their pockets. The swelling crowds just flowed through the gates. It maximized revenue for Sulpicio Lines and for anyone taking a cut. The official passenger count was, well, it was meaningless from the start.
I can understand the economic incentive, I guess, but the sheer physical reality of it, the overloading must have been obvious to anyone watching.
Oh, absolutely. The survivor testimony leaves no doubt about how visible this negligence was. One survivor, Ludia Pascal, she described the passengers as being crammed like cockroaches or ants.
Wow.
I mean, think about the power of that description. It's a dehumanization of the human cargo that really speaks volumes about how the company, and maybe even the officials, viewed the very people they were supposed to be transporting safely.
And the ship itself was showing signs of distress before it even left the harbor?
Yes. When the Doña Paz finally cast off its lines at 6:30 that morning, it was noticeably listing to one side. It was already dangerously unstable from the sheer human weight on board, a payload nearly 3 times its declared capacity. The ship itself was signaling that it was an accident just waiting to the next catalyst.
And that visible negligence, that clear state of being overloaded, that should have triggered immediate intervention from any regulator on the dock.
It should have.
The fact that it didn't, that just reinforces your point. This was systemic failure from the ground up. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and just tragically preordained. The disaster wasn't just about one overloaded ship. It was about the confluence of 2 vessels, both of which were operating at the absolute fringes of maritime safety.
The sources call it a collision between a resurrected wreck and a floating hazard.
That's a powerful phrase.
It's completely accurate. It's critical to understand the biographies of these 2 hulls because neither of them was a seaworthy vessel operating under anything close to optimal conditions. Both ships carried significant known physical and operational liabilities into that strait.
So let's start with the big one, the MV Doña Paz. You called it the phoenix that burned twice. It had a fraught history long before this incident.
A very fraught history. It was originally built back in 1963 in Japan. It was called the Himyuri Maru, built by Onomichi Dockyard.
And it was built for a very different purpose.
A completely different purpose. This is key. It was designed specifically for the calm, placid inland seas of Japan. Its original safe design capacity was for a modest 608 passengers.
600? Okay.
Then Sulpicio Lines acquires it in 1975. They rename it the Don Sulpicio.
And its fiery history began almost right away.
It did. In 1979, while it was sailing to Cebu, the Don Sulpicio caught fire. The blaze was catastrophic. It completely gutted the interior of the ship.
Were people hurt?
Thankfully, the crew and passengers were all rescued safely, but the vessel itself was officially declared a constructive total loss by the insurers.
Which should mean it's done. It goes to the scrapyard.
Under any normal, safe international maritime practice, yes. A constructive total loss should be scrapped or maybe sold for minimal parts. It should not be carrying passengers again.
But Sulpicio Lines made a chilling economic calculation instead.
They absolutely did. They repurchased the burnt-out hulk from the underwriters at a drastically reduced rock-bottom price. Then they undertook this big refurbishment, a resurrection, if you will.
And in this resurrection, they made some changes.
They made significant structural changes designed for one thing and one thing only, to maximize passenger density. And this is how they managed to declare a new legal capacity of 1,518.
So what does that kind of modification actually mean functionally? You're taking a vessel designed for 600 people in calm waters, and you're structurally altering it to cram in more than double that number for what are often rougher open sea passages.
It means you're adding makeshift berths everywhere. You're expanding communal sleeping areas into spaces that were never designed for it, and you're completely ignoring the core engineering realities, the original ballast, the stability calculations, the evacuation routes, all of which were designed for 608 people, not 1,500, and certainly not 4,000.
It just highlights this systemic flaw in the industry at the time.
A pervasive one. This heavy reliance on aging, second-hand Japanese tonnage, which was then modified far beyond its original safer specifications, all for profit. They were literally playing with fire in the design and operation of this ship, long before the actual fire.
So if the Doña Paz was this overstretched, cheaply modified vessel, then the MT Vector, the ship it collided with, was a pure rogue actor.
The Vector was a hazard in every single sense of the word. A small motor tanker, about 629 tons. It was owned by Vector Shipping Corporation, but at the time it was chartered by Caltex Philippines to transport fuel.
And the post-disaster investigation, the BMI findings, they just revealed this laundry list of problems.
A shocking list of operational deficiencies that made it profoundly unseaworthy before it even left the dock.
Let's go through them, because these are not small issues. These are fundamental failures of regulation.
Absolutely. Okay,
Yeah.
Failure number one. It was operating without a valid coastwise license.
Meaning,
It had no legal right to be sailing between ports in the Philippines. It shouldn't have been there.
okay, what's next?
Failure number two. Its certificate of inspection had expired. No regulatory body had recently verified its fitness to sail or the functionality of its safety equipment.
So it's illegal and uninspected.
And then, failure number three. The crew was catastrophically underqualified. The master lacked the appropriate command experience for that specific type of vessel and essential safety roles. Most crucially, the required lookout. They were unfilled.
No one is on lookout duty.
The post was empty. So an unlicensed ship, uninspected, sailing with an incompetent crew.
And what about the actual mechanical state of the ship?
That's failure number four, and maybe the most terrifying of all. The ship's rudder was defective.
Defective how?
It required a complex, two-man manual operation just to steer the vessel.
2 people to turn the rudder.
Yes, so think about the practical implication of that. Steering corrections can't be made instantly. In an emergency situation, that split-second delay, the time it takes for 2 people to coordinate a manual turn, that is the difference between a near miss and a collision.
And this severely compromised, unseaworthy vessel was carrying what essentially amounted to a kinetic weapon.
Precisely. It was a floating bomb. It was loaded with 8,800 barrels of highly volatile petroleum products, gasoline, kerosene, and diesel.
How much is that in liters?
It's roughly 1.05 million liters of fuel. This quantity in this type of cargo meant that if there was any significant breach of the hull, the result wouldn't be a slow leak. It would be an instantaneous cataclysmic explosion. The collision was, in many ways, preordained because the Vector was sailing as an industrial weapon with absolutely no effective safety controls.
So before we get to the collision itself, let's just firmly establish the true human count on the Doña Paz, because the official manifest wasn't just inaccurate, it was a commercial fiction designed to shield Sulpicio Lines from responsibility.
Yeah, the official paperwork, it claimed 1,493 passengers and 59 crew. But the truth is, the system of overcrowding was highly layered.
What do you mean by layered?
Well, first you had the element of hidden passengers. We're talking about hundreds of children, mostly under the age of 4, who were intentionally concealed by their parents to avoid paying the fare.
They were just trying to save a few pesos.
Exactly. But it means they were completely unlisted, completely unaccounted for in the records or any kind of safety drill. They didn't officially exist on that ship.
And beyond the families, there was this other element of power and influence overriding the rules. A phenomenon that we need to define, palakasan.
That's right. Palakasan comes from the root word lakas, which means strength or influence, and it refers to this deeply ingrained culture of patronage, where your rank, your power, your connections, they let you bypass the formal ticketed procedures.
So who is using this?
Survivor testimony indicated there were approximately 1,000 soldiers, police officers, and other privileged individuals on board. Many of them just used their badges, their palakas, to get on the ship without buying a ticket or being formally registered.
1,000 people.
1,000 people who contributed to the deadly payload without a single piece of tracking paper.
So you add it all up, the official manifest, the hidden children, the palakasan borders, and you arrive at that final, devastating estimated payload of over 4,000 souls.
And that overcrowding didn't just affect the ship's stability. It set the psychological and physical stage for total disaster. But what's equally damning was the culture on the bridge of both ships. in the hours leading up to the
A
impact.
dereliction of duty.
A true dereliction of fundamental maritime duty.
So what exactly were the senior officers on the Doña Paz doing during this critical passage through the strait?
Accounts from survivors paint a picture of just utter unprofessionalism. The senior officers, and this includes the captain, they reportedly left their post on the bridge to go to a party in the officers' quarters.
But parties.
Socializing, drinking, listening to loud music. This left the navigation of a massively overloaded vessel in a busy shipping lane, a task requiring intense vigilance, to an apprentice seaman.
The least experienced person on the bridge.
The least experienced person on the bridge was in command.
The entire command structure had functionally collapsed hours before the collision. And the Vector, the floating bomb, it wasn't any better managed, I assume.
Not at all. Its essential lookout post was completely unmanned, which violates a core safety regulation. We know the crew was either resting, fatigued, or, just engaged in other non-critical activities.
And there was no communication between the ships?
None. This is crucial. Both vessels were navigating in the dark without functioning, or at least unmonitored, radios. They were essentially silent, blind giants.
Relying only on eyesight.
Unreliable visual sight in the vastness of the dark strait. They were supposed to be monitoring each other via radar and radio. They missed every single opportunity for communication or avoidance.
And that leads us to the moment of impact. 22.30 hours. 10.30 p.m. on December 20th.
The collision occurred near Jumali Point, Marinduque. And critically, you have to remember, the weather was clear.
No storm, no fog.
No typhoon, no fog, no mitigating factor of nature to blame this on. This was purely human error under clear conditions. Because of the Vector's difficulty in steering and the Doña Paz's lack of experienced navigation, the prow of the smaller Vector just rammed violently into the port side of the larger Doña Paz.
And the breach of the hull was catastrophic for the Doña Paz, but the true destructive force that came from the tanker's cargo.
The impact instantly ruptured the Vector's cargo holds, and the physics involved. They turned that 1.05 million liters of fuel into an immediate, highly flammable vapor cloud, which ignited instantly.
So not a fire that grew, but an explosion.
An immediate cataclysmic explosion. It spread a massive fireball that instantaneously engulfed both vessels. One survivor described the sound not just as a crash, but as a bomb going off. The disaster was simultaneously a sinking, a collision, and a mass burning. The physics of that disaster meant that the explosion immediately just completely destroyed the main electrical systems on the Doña Paz.
Total darkness.
Plunged into total darkness. One survivor, Luzgardo Nido, he was a constable, he vividly recounted the lights just going out within minutes of the crash. The only illumination was from the advancing, swirling wall of fire and the terrified screams of thousands of trapped passengers.
And that overcrowding, which was an economic convenience for the operator just hours before.
It instantly became a physical, unavoidable death trap.
How so?
Well, corridors and stairwells that were meant for, maybe a few dozen people at a time were instantly clogged by thousands trying to escape. As they rushed the exits, the sheer crush of bodies created these human bottlenecks that physically crushed the weak, the old, the sick.
And the fire is spreading.
Spreading fast. At the same time, toxic smoke and intense heat from the fuel fire began to rapidly asphyxiate those who were trapped below decks.
And then comes the most chilling administrative detail. The systemic betrayal that turned this ship from just an unsafe transport into a locked coffin. The life vests.
This is one of the most damning details in the entire investigation. Multiple survivors testified, and inquiry later confirmed this, that the steel lockers containing the life vests were locked shut.
Locked? Why on earth would they be locked?
The official reason given by the company was purely economic. It was to prevent theft or pilferage.
They were worried about poor passengers stealing the life vest.
That was the logic. A minor, calculated economic risk management strategy that immediately condemned thousands of people to death.
Wait, let me get this straight. The company prioritized saving, what, a few hundred pesos worth of life vests over the immediate available safety of thousands of passengers? That's an unbelievable level of calculated disregard for human life.
It speaks to a fundamental prioritization. Profit over safety, every time. In the moment of supreme crisis, the most basic mandatory safety equipment was completely inaccessible.
So people couldn't get to them.
People had to try and break open these steel lockers with their bare hands with debris, wasting precious minutes that could have been used to escape the smoke or jump overboard. For the vast majority trapped inside that burning hull, It was already far too late.
And the crew, the people who should have been leading an evacuation.
The crew collapse was immediate and total.
What did they do?
Survivors reported seeing crew members running in panic, actively stripping off their uniforms so they could blend in with the civilian passengers just to secure their own escape.
So no guidance, no leadership.
Absolutely none. The entire structure of command just disintegrated the moment the fire began.
And the most terrifying element here is that the sea, which is usually the last refuge in a shipwreck, it wasn't a refuge at all.
Not in this case. The massive amount of spilled petroleum from the Vector ignited on the water's surface, creating a literal lagoon of fire that stretched for miles across the strait.
This is what makes the Doña Paz so different from other maritime disasters.
Completely. The primary threat wasn't drowning. It wasn't even hypothermia like with the Titanic. Here, the choice for many was between burning alive on the deck or jumping into a churning cauldron of fire. Passengers standing at the rails looked down, not into dark, safe water, but into a sea illuminated by flames.
The story of survivor 𝐏𝐿𝐴, it
It
encapsulates this impossible choice. He recalled having to choose between burning on the ship or diving into the burning water itself.
His story is harrowing, and it reveals the extreme measures you needed to take to survive. He described the sea as being itself a fire. To survive, he and a few others had to time their jump perfectly. They had to dive as deep as they possibly could under the burning surface, hold their breath until their lungs felt like they would burst.
And then swim underwater to get past the flame.
Exactly. Swim laterally, horizontally, to try and breach the surface beyond the primary fire line. This required immense physical stamina, coordination, and lung capacity.
And that endurance factor, it speaks directly to the demographic of who survived. It wasn't about luck. It was about extreme physical fitness.
It absolutely was. And we see this with other survivors. There was Salvador Baxal, a fisherman, traveling with his 18-year-old daughter, Eludia. His instinct was to grab her and physically throw her into the ocean and then jump in right after, swimming through that thick, burning slick.
So the survivors were overwhelmingly
Able-bodied young men, soldiers, or those with the kind of extreme physical conditioning you see in seafarers or fishermen. The very old, the very young, and anyone with a physical limitation. They were largely condemned by the sheer physical demand of escaping, even if they managed to reach the rails.
And then, on top of all that physical horror, there's a final layer of administrative chaos. The official count of 26 survivors is already horrifyingly small, but even that number was apparently wrong.
Yes, the story of Valeriana Duma. She was only 14 at the time. It highlights this deep administrative failure. She survived, she clung to a life jacket her employer gave her, but she was separated from her family and her group.
And she wasn't counted.
For 25 years, she lived in complete obscurity. Never listed among the official survivors, never listed among the casualties. She was finally found in 2012. Her very existence proves that the true casualty and survival counts were always higher and far murkier than the inadequate official records ever allowed.
And we can't overlook one final layer of pure psychological terror that's mentioned in the sources: sharks.
That's right. The Tabas Strait is notoriously shark-infested. While the fire was the primary killer, the psychological terror for those in the water was multiplied by the environment. Survivors recounted swimming desperately among thousands of floating charred bodies, often feeling the movements of large predators beneath the burning slick. It was a terrifying, chaotic, and completely dehumanizing environment for the few who struggled to stay afloat until morning. The final, damning systemic failure in all of this was the completely inexcusable delay in the rescue operations. The timeline of the official response, it just exposes an utter lack of coordination, communication, and readiness within the Philippine Maritime Authorities in 1987.
So let's walk through the chronology of this failure. It's really shocking.
Okay, so the collision and fire happened at 10:30 p.m. The Doña Paz sinks in about 2 hours, and the Vector follows 2 hours after that.
So by about 2:30 a.m., both ships are gone and 4,000 people are in the water.
In a sea of fire. Shockingly, the maritime authorities were not formally notified until 8 hours after the incident.
8 hours of silence.
8 hours of zero official response, no dispatch, nothing. And even after they were notified, it took another 8 hours, a full working day, to actually mobilize any serious search and rescue assets.
16 hours. A 16-hour delay in responding to the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history. What was the explanation for that gap? Was it just bureaucracy? Apathy?
It was a combination of everything. Bureaucracy, a lack of any centralized command structure, and a reliance on outdated, unmonitored communication methods. No one was immediately monitoring the appropriate distress frequencies, and there just was no standard protocol for rapidly escalating a maritime incident of this scale.
Despite the fact that these overloaded ferries were a known risk.
Unknown daily risk. That 16-hour wait effectively condemned any injured survivor who had managed to escape the fire, who was now suffering from severe burns, exposure, or smoke inhalation.
And the only immediate mercy, the only help that came was from a completely independent civilian source.
That's right. The MV Don Claudio, a passing inter-island ship, saw this massive glow of the fire on the horizon. The captain, acting entirely on his own initiative, diverted his course and arrived at the scene about an hour after the initial collision.
What did they find?
The crew of the Don Claudio found a horrific scene, a sea just covered in thick, burning oil and thousands upon thousands of floating, charred corpses.
They weren't conducting a rescue mission, they were performing a desperate retrieval.
Exactly. They just threw cargo nets and ropes over the side and managed to pull up the 26 survivors that are in the official record. By the time the government forces finally arrived, 16 hours later, the rescue operation was effectively over. It was a retrieval operation for bodies and debris.
And this brings us to the forensic accounting of the dead, because Sulpicio Lines immediately tried to suppress the true number, sticking to their fake manifest.
Oh, absolutely. Sulpicio Lines initially claimed only 1,493 passengers based on that manifest, but that lie just quickly collapsed under the sheer volume of bodies being recovered and the overwhelming number of claims being filed by desperate relatives.
So they had to revise it.
By December 23rd, they only grudgingly revised it to 1,583. But the real investigative work was being done by concerned local officials and journalists on the ground.
People like Representative Raul Daza.
Rap Daza was key. He diligently collected names from relatives in Samar and Leyte, the home provinces, and he quickly identified at least 2,000 unmanifested people who were definitively on board.
It wasn't until much later that an official body put the final number together.
Not until 1999. A presidential task force was established to analyze all the available court records, settlement claims, and eyewitness accounts. They placed the final estimated passenger count at 4,342, plus 58 Doña Paz crew and 1 Vector crew member.
Which brings the final verified estimated fatality count to 4,385.
That number confirms its horrific status as the world's deadliest peacetime maritime disaster. But more importantly, that number, 4,385, it's not just a statistic. It represents the scale of the systemic failure to properly account for every single human being that boarded that vessel.
The aftermath of the tragedy became this protracted legal war of attrition. You have impoverished, grieving families on one side and 2 corporate giants on the other, Sulpicio Lines and Caltex Philippines.
And the families in Sulpicio tried to hold Caltex liable, right? I mean, Vector was an unlicensed, unseaworthy hazard that Caltex had hired.
It seems like a clear-cut case.
And this is where maritime and commercial contract law just brutally intervened, prioritizing business contracts over public safety. The critical legal battle, Caltex versus Sulpicio Lines, it went all the way to the Supreme Court of the Philippines.
And the ruling was a shock.
It was a ruling that protected corporate interests.
So how did Caltex manage to shield itself from responsibility for chartering a vessel that was demonstrably a death trap?
It all came down to the specific type of contract they used, a voyage charter. And the court drew a very sharp legal distinction here.
What was the distinction?
They stated that under a voyage charter, Caltex merely hired the vessel for a specific delivery trip. Critically, the court ruled that Caltex did not manage the crew or the technical operation of the ship. That remained the responsibility of Vector Shipping.
So because they didn't control the crew, they were absolved of responsibility for the ship's condition.
Precisely. The ruling stated that a voyage charterer has the right to assume the vessel is seaworthy and is not legally required to personally inspect the ship's licenses or certificates.
That's an incredible legal shield.
It is. It shielded Caltex from potentially billions of pesos in liability, and it cemented this idea that responsibility rests only with the ship operator, even if the charterer hired a known hazard.
So that ruling effectively shifted the entire financial burden onto Vector Shipping, a smaller company, and Sulpicio Lines.
And Sulpicio, despite owning the grossly overcrowded ferry, engaged in a decades-long aggressive strategy of just delaying all the civil suits.
Stalling.
Completely stalling. They relied on the fact that the plaintiffs were poor, grieving, and just lacked the resources to fight a long legal battle. Sulpicio Lines offered families this paltry initial payout of just 20,000 pesos per victim.
Which is nothing.
Barely enough to cover funeral costs at the time. Most families, thankfully, refused this insult and chose instead to join a U.S. class action suit.
Which unfortunately ended in deep disappointment.
Yeah, that suit dragged on for years until the U.S. courts finally dismissed it due to jurisdictional issues, sending the whole thing back to the Philippines. Justice was profoundly delayed.
So when did families finally see any real compensation?
It wasn't until 2017, 30 years after the sinking. That's when significant, though still modest, payouts ranging from 200,000 to 400,000 pesos were finally distributed. For many of the aging survivors and claimants, the money arrived long after the parents, spouses, or siblings they were seeking justice for had already died waiting.
Oh.
You know, one of the most disturbing findings related to the Doña Paz is the profile of recidivism displayed by Sulpicio lines. In any other heavily regulated environment, anywhere else in the world, a disaster of this magnitude, caused by gross, proven negligence, overcrowding, locked life vests, an apprentice at the helm, that should result in the immediate and permanent revocation of their operating franchise.
Maybe the Sulpicio lines just kept operating, leading to what journalists and the public rightly started calling the Sulpicio curse.
It demonstrates a fundamental, profound, and deadly failure of the Philippine regulatory state. The Doña Paz disaster was in 1987. But just consider the subsequent safety record under the very same corporate banner.
Just 1 year later.
1 year later, 1988, the MV Doña Marilyn capsizes in a typhoon. Nearly 400 people killed. A decade later, 1998, the MV Princess of the Orient sinks, killing around 150. And then, most notoriously, in 2008, the MV Princess of the Stars capsizes.
That 2008 sinking was devastating, and it reinforced this pattern of corporate risk-taking.
It was. That ship sailed directly into the path of a powerful typhoon, Fengshan, despite clear warnings. The investigation later showed the ship was carrying 10,000 tons of cargo when its capacity was only 7,000.
And there was more.
It was also carrying highly toxic agricultural chemicals that were recovered from the wreckage, posing a whole other ecological disaster. That single sinking killed over 800 people.
So you're looking at a cumulative death toll of over 5,000 people across just 2 decades, all tied directly to one family's shipping operation.
And it took that 2008 tragedy, 21 years after the Doña Paz, for the government to finally suspend their passenger license.
And even then, the corporate structure didn't really collapse, did it?
Not at all. The Go family, who owns Sulpicio Lines, they just rebranded the company as Philippine Span Asia Carrier Corporation, or PSACC, and strategically shifted the focus of their operations primarily to cargo,
Which allowed them to escape the heavier regulatory scrutiny of passenger travel.
while maintaining their dominant economic position. The structural incentives that rewarded risk, they remained intact.
That ongoing corporate impunity, it really speaks to the core cultural indictment of this whole tragedy. It wasn't just a breakdown of specific safety rules. It was a cultural acceptance of extreme risk.
That is the tragic conclusion. And that's where we have to define this idea of a banca culture.
What does that mean?
Banca literally refers to a traditional, small, wooden outrigger boat. But in this context, it describes a cultural mindset where overloading, cramming in just one more person, one more bag of rice is seen as communal helping, a necessary economic risk, or just a benign tradition.
And that mindset clashed with industrial shipping.
It clashed fatally with the complex, ruthless physics and engineering demands of modern industrial shipping. The system encouraged risk, the culture tolerated it, and the law, as we saw, protected the corporations who profited from it.
For decades, the physical evidence of this disaster, the ships themselves, were missing. For 32 years, the location of the Doña Paz was just a set of estimated coordinates, a mass grave without a marker.
The wrecks were finally located in April 2019 by the research vessel RV Petrel, which was funded by the estate of Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen. And they finally provided this haunting visual monument to the disaster.
And what did that discovery reveal about their final resting place?
The wrecks were found at a depth of about 500 meters. That's around 1,640 feet. Crucially, they found both the Doña Paz and the Vector sitting upright on the seabed about 2,200 meters apart from each other.
So it didn't change the investigation's conclusions.
No, the imagery didn't provide new forensic evidence to change the conclusions of negligence, but what it did was serve as the final, silent deep-sea monument to the 4,300 souls whose bodies were never recovered and who remain entombed there to this day.
So what does this all mean? When you put it all together, the core lesson here is chillingly clear. The Doña Paz tragedy was not an isolated event. It was caused by these deep structural incentives for negligence, corporate profit-seeking and regulatory failure. And those incentives persisted long after 1987, as the Sulpicio curse demonstrates.
It did.
The 4,386 lives lost in the Tabla Strait. They're a permanent, horrifying indictment of a system that calculated the cost of providing safety and found it was simply too expensive to bother with.
And, while we do see some genuine progress today, you have newer, faster craft, modern roll-off vessels replacing some of those truly aging liners. The ghost of the Doña still remains this powerful cautionary tale in the maritime world. The sea is an unforgiving and impartial judge of human error, especially when there's an absence of strict enforcement and corporate conscience. So the fundamental question we're left with is this. Given the power of profit and the historical weakness of regulation, how long will the costs of negligence remain hidden beneath the surface before the sea, the eternal collector, demands its inevitable debt again?